Deep within the territorial records of Dakota Prairie lies a file that territorial officials sealed for over 40 years, the case of Henrik Olsen and the 23 souls who vanished during what locals still whisper about as the Devil's March. On February 14, 1889, 24 people departed from Fort Buford, heading west toward the newly established settlements near present-day Williston. 3 days later, only one man stumbled back through the gates, frostbitten, delirious, and clutching a leather pouch filled with gold coins that didn't belong to him. The survivor's account of wolves, blizzards, and heroic attempts to save his companions satisfied investigators for exactly 6 weeks until a trapper named Ezra Kowalski discovered something in a remote canyon that made territorial authorities question everything they thought they knew about survival, loyalty, and the lengths a man will go to claim what isn't his. Before we continue with the story of Henrik Olsen and the families who trusted him with their lives, make sure to hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from, because this tale of betrayal in the frozen wilderness will make you question every story of frontier heroism you've ever heard. What Kowalski found in that canyon didn't just solve the mystery of the missing pioneers. It revealed a calculated cruelty that shocked even the hardened lawmen of the Dakota Territory. The Dakota Territory of 1889 buzzed with the electricity of impending statehood and the promise of free land under the Homestead Act. Fort Buford, positioned strategically along the Missouri River, served as the final outpost before the vast expanse of prairie that stretched endlessly toward the Montana border. Here, families gathered supplies, hired guides, and made final preparations before venturing into territory where the nearest neighbor might be 50 miles away, and winter storms could bury a homestead under 12 ft of snow overnight. Henrik Olsen had built his reputation over 5 bitter Dakota winters. A Norwegian immigrant who spoke English with only the faintest accent, he possessed an uncanny ability to read weather patterns and navigate by stars when landmarks disappeared beneath snow. Standing nearly 6 ft tall with shoulders broadened by years of splitting wood and hauling supplies, Henrik moved through Fort Buford's trading post with the quiet confidence of a man who had never lost a party to the elements. His pale blue eyes seemed to catalog every detail: the weight of supply wagons, the quality of winter clothing, the nervous laughter of children experiencing their first Dakota winter. The families who hired him that February represented the dreams and desperation that drove westward expansion. Thomas and Elilina Bergstrom brought their 3 young daughters along with Elilina's elderly mother, Martha Linkfist, who insisted she wouldn't die in some crowded eastern city when free land awaited in the west. The Kowalski brothers, Jan, Poda, and Stanislaw, pulled their savings from 3 years of railroad work to claim adjacent homesteads where they planned to raise cattle and wheat. Young physician Dr. Samuel Hartwell traveled with his pregnant wife Rebecca and their twin boys, carrying medical equipment and a collection of books he planned to use in establishing the Torritos' first proper hospital. The Brennan family had perhaps the most compelling reason for leaving civilization behind. Patrick Brennan, a former Union cavalry officer, hoped the isolation would help his eldest son, Michael, recover from what doctors politely called soldier's heart. The trembling hands and night terrors that plagued the young man since his return from conflicts with the Lakota. Patrick's wife, Catherine, packed their belongings with the methodical precision of a woman who had moved her family 6 times in 10 years, always chasing the promise of a fresh start. Henrik studied each family with professional interest, noting their resources, their desperation, and most importantly, their trust. He quoted reasonable prices for his services, $50 per family, payable upon safe arrival at their chosen homestead sites. What none of them realized was that Henrik had spent the previous autumn scouting locations that served a very different purpose than homestead sites. The morning of February 14th dawned clear and cold, with temperatures hovering near zero. Unusual warmth for mid-February that Henrik assured his clients would make for easier traveling. The party assembled before sunrise, 6 families, 23 souls ranging in age from Elilina Bergstrom's 4-year old daughter Anna to Martha Lindfist's 72 years, plus their guide. Wagons creaked under the weight of seed grain, farming equipment, medical supplies, and the precious few personal belongings that survived the ruthless culling required for frontier life. Henrik loaded his own supplies with practiced efficiency: canvas, tarps, rope, lantern oil, and a collection of tools that the families assumed were for emergency repairs. Hidden beneath legitimate supplies lay items that served a darker purpose: a small spade, extra blankets that he claimed were for emergencies, and a detailed map marked with locations that weren't homestead sites. As the party departed Fort Buford, following the frozen Missouri River westward, Henrik pointed out landmarks and shared stories of successful homesteaders who had carved prosperous lives from the unforgiving prairie. His confidence was infectious. Even Martha Lindvist, who had complained bitterly about leaving her church community in Minnesota, began to speak hopefully about the vegetable garden she would plant come spring. None of them noticed that Henrik kept checking a small compass, or that the route he chose deviated slightly from the established trail markers. The families were too busy managing their children, soothing nervous livestock, and marveling at the endless expanse of snow-covered grassland that stretched to every horizon. By the second day, when the established trail should have curved south toward the settlements near present-day Williston, Henrik announced that he knew a more direct route, a shortcut that would save them 2 days of travel. The decision seemed logical. Supplies were holding out well. The weather remained stable, and everyone was eager to reach their destinations before the next storm system moved through. That shortcut led them directly into the most remote section of the Little Missouri Badlands, where deep coulees and rocky outcroppings created natural barriers that would hide whatever happened next from the rest of the world. The storm struck on the third day with the sudden violence that only Dakota blizzards can achieve. One moment the party traveled under an overcast but manageable sky. The next wind-driven snow reduced visibility to mere feet, and temperatures plummeted to 20 below zero. Henrik called for the wagons to form a protective circle, standard procedure for prairie travel. But instead of sheltering in the center, he guided them toward what he claimed was a natural windbreak in a nearby. Dr. Hartwell later described in testimony that was never made public the growing sense of unease he felt as Henrik led them deeper into terrain that offered no shelter from the howling wind. The windbreak turned out to be a box canyon with steep walls that funneled the storm's fury directly down upon the huddled families. When Thomas Bergstrom suggested they should return to higher ground and wait out the blizzard in the open prairie, Henrik insisted that moving in such conditions would be suicide. "The storm will break by morning," Henrik assured them, his voice barely audible over the wind. "We just need to keep the children warm through the night." But the storm didn't break. For 48 hours, the families huddled in wagons that provided little protection from wind that drove snow through every crack and crevice. Food supplies carefully rationed, for the journey began to run dangerously low as the delay stretched into a third day. More alarming still, several family members began showing signs of frost, despite their best efforts to stay warm. It was during this second night that young Michael Brennan, already troubled by his war experiences, began to notice inconsistencies in their behavior. While the families grew increasingly desperate, sharing blankets and body heat to survive, Henrik seemed remarkably well prepared for the extended delay. He had extra food in his personal supplies, additional firewood that he claimed to have gathered before the storm, and most puzzling of all, he appeared to know exactly where to find shelter. When nature calls became unavoidable, he moved through this canyon like he's been here before. Michael whispered to his father during a brief lull in the wind, "Look how he goes straight to that rock formation when he needs to attend to business. No hesitation, no searching around." Patrick Brennan, exhausted from helping maintain fires and care for the younger children, initially dismissed his son's observations as the paranoid thinking that had plagued Michael since the war. But as the third day wore on, Patrick began to notice things himself. Henrik never seemed to struggle with finding dry firewood, despite the fact that the storm had soaked everything in sight. His personal supplies never seemed to diminish, even as he generously shared with families whose provisions were running out. Most disturbing of all was Henrik's reaction when Thomas Bergstrom suggested sending out a small party to search for better shelter. The guide's usual calm demeanor cracked just enough to reveal something cold and calculating underneath. "No one leaves the group," Henrik stated firmly. "In weather like this, separated from the party means death. I've seen it happen too many times." When Dr. Hartwell offered to accompany any scouting party, citing his responsibility to the pregnant Rebecca and the other vulnerable members of the group, Henrik's response was even more troubling. "Doctor, you're needed here. Besides, I'm the only one who knows these badlands well enough to navigate safely. Trust me, I've guided families through worse than this." The problem with Henrik's reassurance was that he had specifically chosen this route as a shortcut that would avoid the badlands entirely. The contradiction wasn't lost on those who were still thinking clearly despite the cold and hunger. On the morning of the fourth day, Henrik made an announcement that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. He claimed to have spotted smoke in the distance, possibly another party of travelers, or perhaps a trapper's cabin where they could find shelter. He would scout ahead alone, he said, and return within 6 hours with news. "Keep the fires burning and stay close to the wagons," he instructed. "If I'm not back by sunset, send up 3 smoke signals and I'll find you." Henrik departed on his horse, carrying only a light pack and his rifle. What he didn't tell the families was that he was heading toward a cache of supplies he had hidden the previous autumn, supplies that would sustain him comfortably while he waited for nature to eliminate the witnesses to his next crime. The families never saw Henrik Olsen again. By sunset of the fourth day, they were burning wagon wheels to maintain enough heat to keep the children alive. By the morning of the fifth day, they faced the terrible choice between staying put and hoping their guide would return, or abandoning the wagons and attempting to reach civilization on foot through snow that was chest-deep in places. Martha Lindfist, the eldest member of the party, made the decision that sealed their fate. "He's not coming back," she stated with the brutal honesty of someone who had lived through 7 decades of human nature. "Something's happened to him," or she didn't finish the thought, but everyone understood the implication. They chose to wait one more day. Henrik Olsen's return to Fort Buford on February 19th created a sensation that rippled through the territorial communities along the Missouri River. Stumbling through the gates just after dawn, frostbitten and incoherent, he collapsed before the commanding officer and uttered words that would be recorded in official reports and repeated in whispered conversations for decades to come. "They're all gone, the wolves. Dear God, the wolves." The story Henrik told once he had recovered sufficiently to give a coherent account painted it as a tragic hero who had watched helplessly as nature claimed the lives of 23 innocent people. According to his testimony, the storm had been worse than anything he had experienced in 5 years of guiding parties through Dakota Territory, despite his best efforts to find shelter and maintain morale. The extended cold had weakened the group to the point where they became easy prey for a pack of wolves that had been driven from their usual hunting grounds by the same storm. "I tried to fight them off." Henrik sobbed to Territorial Marshal James McReynolds, displaying genuine tears and wounds on his hands that appeared consistent with his story, but there were so many, and the people were too weak to run. The Bergstrom girls, dear Christ, the sound they made. Henrik's account included precise details about the storm's progression, the location where they had sheltered, and the individual acts of heroism he claimed to have witnessed as families tried to protect each other from both the elements and the wolf attack. He spoke movingly of Dr. Hartwell's final moments, allegedly spent tending to the wounded, even as wolves circled the group, and of Thomas Bergstrom's last stand, using a broken wagon wheel as a weapon to defend his daughters. The story was compelling, tragic, and completely believable to men who had witnessed the Dakota Territo's capacity for sudden, merciless violence. Marshal McReynolds, himself a veteran of Indian campaigns and prairie blizzards, found nothing in Henrik's account that contradicted his understanding of how quickly disaster could strike isolated travelers. More importantly, Henrik had physical evidence to support his claims. The leather pouch he clutched when he arrived at Fort Buford contained exactly the amount of money the families would have carried, their combined savings for purchasing supplies and paying filing fees for their homestead claims. Henrik explained that he had gathered the money from the bodies, intending to ensure it reached the family's relatives back east, rather than enriching scavengers who might eventually discover the tragedy. It seemed the least I could do for them, Henrik explained. Thomas Bergstrom made me promise before the end that I would see his family's savings returned to his brother in Milwaukee. The others, they asked the same thing. It was all I could do for them. The territorial authorities organized a recovery expedition within days of Henrik's return, but the late February thaw had begun, making travel treacherous and limiting the search to areas accessible by horseback. When the party returned after a week in the field, they reported finding scattered evidence of the tragedy, scraps of clothing, broken wagon parts, and disturbed snow that could have been the site of a wolf attack, but no bodies. Marshal McReynolds explained the lack of remains in terms that made perfect sense to anyone familiar with frontier life. Wolves don't leave much behind, especially when they're desperate from a hard winter. The scavengers would have cleaned up whatever the pack missed. Henrik Olsen was officially cleared of any wrongdoing and praised for his survival skills and his efforts to honor the victims' final wishes. He used the family's savings to purchase a homestead of his own, claiming that he intended to establish a memorial to the lost pioneers by creating the kind of prosperous farm they had dreamed of building. For 6 weeks, Henrik's story stood unchallenged. He had settled into his new property, begun planning spring planting, and even spoken with the territorial newspaper about establishing a guide service that would emphasize safety and proper preparation for prairie travel. Local citizens pointed to Henrik as an example of how tragedy could inspire a man to build something meaningful from loss. Then Ezra Kowalski made his discovery. Kowalski was a Polish immigrant who had spent 3 years trapping beaver and mink along the tributaries of the Little Missouri River. Unlike the farmers and townsfolk who had accepted Henrik's story, Kowalski possessed intimate knowledge of how both wolves and humans behaved in the Dakota Badlands. More importantly, he had been in the area during the February storm and knew that Henrik's description of the weather patterns didn't match what had actually occurred. Following his trap lines through a remote canyon approximately 40 miles from the site Henrik claimed for the tragedy, Kowalski discovered what would later be described in territorial court documents as evidence of human habitation inconsistent with emergency shelter. Hidden beneath a rocky overhang protected from wind and snow, someone had constructed an elaborate camp equipped with enough supplies to sustain several people for weeks. The camp included items that had clearly been placed there before the storm: dry fire, wood cut and stacked in precise rows, canvas shelter materials designed for extended use, and most damning of all, a cache of food supplies that far exceeded what any prudent guide would carry for emergency use. Someone had prepared this site as a deliberate refuge, not a chance discovery. More troubling still were the personal items Kowalski found scattered around the camp. A child's mitten bearing the initials a B, a woman's hairpin of the style favored by Swedish immigrants, a man's pocket watch engraved with the initials TB, Thomas Bergstrom's initials. When Kowalski brought his discoveries to Marshal McReynolds, the territorial authorities faced a terrible possibility. Henrik Olsen's story of heroic survival might be an elaborate fiction designed to cover a crime that challenged everything they thought they knew about frontier tragedy and human nature. The investigation that followed Ezra Kowalski's discovery revealed inconsistencies in Henrik's story that grew more troubling with each piece of evidence. Marshal McReynolds, accompanied by Territorial Judge William Hartfield and a small party of deputies, conducted a thorough examination of the hidden camp and began comparing physical evidence with the official account of the tragedy. The first major discrepancy involved the timeline. Henrik claimed the storm had trapped his party for 4 days before the wolf attack occurred. However, The supplies cached at the hidden camp suggested preparation for a much longer stay. The firewood alone represented days of cutting and stacking work that would have been impossible to accomplish during the storm Henrik described. More significant was the location itself. Henrik had described seeking shelter in a box canyon that offered minimal protection from the elements, a decision that would be illogical for an experienced guide unless he had ulterior motives for leading the group to that specific location. The hidden camp, by contrast, was situated in an ideal shelter that would have been the obvious choice for anyone genuinely seeking to protect 23 people from a blizzard. Judge Hartfield, a former prosecutor from Ohio, who had been appointed to bring Eastern legal standards to territorial justice, ordered a more comprehensive search of the area. What his team discovered painted an increasingly sinister picture of the February tragedy. Following a trail that connected the hidden camp to the site Henrik described as the scene of the wolf attack, investigators found evidence that someone had made multiple trips between the two locations during and after the storm. Bootprints preserved in patches of hard-packed snow suggested that one person wearing the type of heavy boots Henrik favored had traveled this route at least 6 times over a period of several days. At the official tragedy site, closer examination revealed details that contradicted the story of a desperate last stand against wolves. The scattered wagon parts were arranged in a pattern that suggested deliberate dismantling rather than destruction by desperate people seeking firewood. Personal items were distributed in a way that indicated systematic searching, not the chaos of a wolf attack. Most damning of all was the discovery of items that Henrik had failed to mention in his original testimony. Hidden beneath a pile of rocks, investigators found a collection of valuables that the families would have carried. Jewelry, additional money, and documents that proved the victims had been far wealthier than Henrik's story suggested. Rebecca Hartwell had been carrying her grandmother's silver locket worth $50, a substantial sum that Henrik had somehow failed to include in his account of gathering the victims' belongings. The Kowalski brothers had pulled their railroad wages into a money belt containing over $300, far more than the amount Henrik had returned to authorities. Thomas Bergstrom carried not just family savings, but also a collection of gold coins inherited from his father's shipping business. The evidence suggested that Henrik Olsen had robbed the families before allowing them to die, but proving premeditated murder required understanding exactly how 23 people had perished in circumstances that their guide survived comfortably. Marshal McReynolds brought in Dr. Charles Whitman, the territorial physician who had examined Henrik upon his return to Fort Buford. Dr. Whitman's initial assessment had supported Henrik's story. The guide showed signs of frostbite and exposure consistent with surviving a blizzard. However, when asked to reconsider his findings in light of new evidence, Dr. Whitman admitted that Henrik's injuries were surprisingly mild for someone who claimed to have spent 4 days exposed to severe weather. His frostbite was superficial. Dr. Whitman testified the kind you might get from spending a few hours in cold weather, not multiple days, and his overall condition. He was hungry and exhausted, certainly, but not in the state I would expect from someone who had endured the ordeal he described. The investigation took a crucial turn when deputies decided to search Henrik's homestead for additional evidence. What they found in the root cellar of his new property shocked even experienced lawmen who had dealt with frontier violence for years. Hidden beneath sacks of seed grain, Henrik had concealed items that clearly belonged to the missing families. Children's clothing still bearing the scent of the perfume Elena Bergstrom used to make her daughters feel special on Sundays. Dr. Hartwell's medical bag containing instruments that Henrik could never have afforded to purchase. Catherine Brennan's wedding ring, a distinctive Irish design that her husband had described in detail when providing information about the victims. But the most disturbing discovery was a detailed journal that Henrik had kept throughout the winter of 18,889. The journal revealed that the February tragedy had not been an opportunistic crime born of desperation, but the culmination of months of careful planning. Henrik had spent the autumn systematically scouting locations in the Badlands, specifically looking for sites that would be difficult to find and impossible to escape from. He had cached supplies at multiple locations, creating a network of hideouts that would allow him to survive comfortably while his victims perished. Most chillingly, the journal contained detailed profiles of potential victims, including assessments of their wealth, their likely routes of travel, and their vulnerability to manipulation. The entry for December 15, 1888, left no doubt about Henrik's intentions. The Bergstrom family inquired today about spring passage to homestead sites near the Yellowstone. They carry substantial savings and travel with elderly mother who would slow any rescue attempts. Perfect candidates for western route through canyon system. Must ensure no other guides are available during their desired travel period. Similar entries documented Henrik's systematic elimination of competition among other guides, his careful cultivation of a reputation for reliability, and his detailed knowledge of weather patterns that would provide natural cover for his crimes. The final entry, dated February 10, 1889, 4 days before the tragic journey began, revealed the cold calculation behind what appeared to be frontier heroism. Weather reports indicate severe storm system approaching from northwest. Families are eager to depart before conditions worsen. Will suggest early departure and direct route through Badlands. With proper preparation, should be able to eliminate all witnesses while maintaining appearance of natural disaster. Must remember to return reasonable portion of victim's money to avoid suspicion. The evidence against Henrik Olsen was overwhelming, but Marshal McReynolds faced a problem that would plague frontier justice for decades. How do you prove murder when the bodies have disappeared and the accused maintains his innocence in the face of seemingly conclusive evidence? Henrik's defense, when confronted with the journal and stolen property, shifted from heroic survivor to victim of circumstance. He claimed the journal entries were fabrications created by someone seeking to frame him, possibly Ezra Kowalski himself, who might have planted evidence to claim the reward money that had been posted for information about the missing families. That Polish trapper has been watching my homestead for weeks, Henrik insisted to Judge Hartfield. He knows I've been successful, knows I've been able to start fresh when others are struggling. He's probably been planning this since I returned from that terrible ordeal. Henrik's explanation for the hidden cache of supplies was equally creative. He claimed to have been preparing a memorial expedition to properly bury the victims once spring, weather made the site accessible. The supplies were intended to sustain a proper burial party, and the valuable items found in his possession were being held in trust until he could locate relatives of the deceased. I was waiting for the right time to contact the families back east, Henrik explained. I wanted to be able to tell them that their loved ones had received a Christian burial, not just that I had failed to protect them from wolves. The story was plausible enough to create reasonable doubt, particularly since the territorial court system was more accustomed to dealing with simple cases of theft and assault than complex investigations involving missing persons. Judge Hartfield found himself in the uncomfortable position of presiding over a case where everyone was certain of the defendant's guilt, but the legal standards for conviction remained frustratingly out of reach. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Michael Brennan, the young veteran whose war-damaged nerves had made him sensitive to details that others might have overlooked. Territorial authorities had initially been reluctant to rely on testimony from someone whose mental state was questionable, but Michael's obsession with the inconsistencies in Henrik's story had led him to conduct his own investigation. Michael had spent weeks retracing the route the party had taken from Fort Buford, interviewing anyone who might have seen the travelers or noticed Henrik's movements in the days leading up to the tragedy. His persistence uncovered a witness whose testimony would finally provide the missing link between Henrik's careful preparations and the victim's disappearance. Sarah Kowalski, Ezra's wife, had been checking trap lines near the hidden camp on February 16th, the day Henrik claimed to be fighting off wolves while his companions died around him. From a ridge overlooking the canyon, Sarah had observed a lone man moving systematically through what appeared to be an abandoned campsite, loading items onto a travois and covering his tracks as he worked. "I thought it was strange," Sarah testified, "because the man was working so carefully like he didn't want to be seen, and he wasn't acting like someone who had just survived a terrible tragedy. He moved like someone who had all the time in the world." Sarah's description of the man's clothing and horse matched Henrik exactly. More importantly, her testimony placed him at the hidden camp on the same day he claimed to be struggling for survival with the families. The timeline made it impossible for Henrik to have been in both places, finally providing concrete evidence that his story was false. But even Sarah's testimony might not have been enough to secure a conviction, if not for the discovery that terrified the investigators more than any evidence they had uncovered so far. While searching the area around the hidden camp one final time, deputies found what appeared to be a shallow grave that had been disturbed by scavengers. The remains they uncovered were not those of adults who had died fighting wolves, but of children who had clearly perished from exposure and starvation. The condition of the bodies suggested they had been alive for days after Henrik claimed the tragedy had ended, possibly calling out for help that never came, while their guide systematically looted their family's possessions from his comfortable hideout. Dr. Whitman's examination of the remains revealed the most horrifying detail of all: evidence that someone had provided the children with just enough food and warmth to keep them alive for several days, but not enough to save them. They had been kept alive, not out of mercy, but to serve as insurance against the possibility that search parties might arrive earlier than Henrik expected. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Dakota Prairie intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The revelation that Henrik had deliberately prolonged the children's suffering transformed the case from robbery and negligent homicide to something far more sinister. The families hadn't simply been abandoned to die. They had been systematically murdered by a man who had spent months planning their destruction while smiling at their children and accepting their trust. The trial of Henrik Olsen began on May 15, 1889 in the Territorial Courthouse at Bismarck. What should have been a straightforward case of frontier justice instead became a legal spectacle that drew observers from across the Dakota Territory and beyond. Eastern newspapers sent correspondents to cover what they sensationalized as the Prairie Wolf murder trial, while local citizens packed the courthouse every day, many having traveled hundreds of miles to witness the proceedings. Henrik entered the courtroom every morning impeccably dressed, maintaining the dignified bearing that had convinced 23 people to trust him with their lives. His demeanor never cracked, even as prosecutor James Mitchell methodically presented evidence that painted him as a calculating predator who had preyed on families seeking nothing more than the chance to build new lives on the frontier. The prosecution's case built inexorably from circumstantial evidence to damning proof of premeditation. Mitchell began with testimony about Henrik's reputation and the trust the families had placed in him, then systematically demolished the heroic survivor narrative with physical evidence, witness testimony, and the damning contents of Henrik's journal. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Mitchell stated in his opening remarks, "we will prove that the defendant did not survive a tragedy. He created one. We will show you that Henrik Olsen spent months planning the systematic murder of innocent families, that he led them deliberately into danger, and that he watched them die while he remained safe and comfortable, counting their money and planning his escape." The prosecution's most effective witness was Dr. Whitman, whose medical testimony about the condition of the children's remains left several jurors visibly shaken. Dr. Whitman explained in clinical detail how prolonged exposure and starvation affected the human body, particularly children, and how the evidence suggested the victims had lived far longer than Henrik's story would have allowed. Based on my examination of the remains, Dr. May Whitman testified, the children survived for at least a week after the supposed wolf attack. They died slowly of cold and hunger while someone nearby possessed ample supplies to save them. Sarah Kowalski's testimony provided the crucial link that placed Henrik at the hidden camp while he claimed to be with the dying families. Her simple, straightforward account of observing a man systematically looting an abandoned campsite destroyed any remaining credibility in Henrik's version of events. But it was Michael Brennan's testimony that provided the most compelling insight into Henrik's character and methods. Despite his reputation for instability, Michael's detailed recollections of the journey and his observations of Henrik's behavior painted a picture of a man who had orchestrated every aspect of the tragedy. He knew exactly where to go in that canyon, Michael testified, his voice steady despite the obvious emotional cost of reliving the experience. Even in the storm, he moved like he'd been there before. And when people started talking about leaving, about finding better shelter, he always had a reason why we should stay put. Always a reason why he was the only one who could make decisions. Michael's account of Henrik's mysterious disappearance to scout for help revealed it for what it truly was, the signal for the final phase of his plan. Once Henrik left the families, they were beyond any hope of rescue. Trapped in a location only he knew about with dwindling supplies and no knowledge of how to survive in the Badlands, the defense led by attorney Robert Carlisle faced an almost impossible task. The evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses credible, and the defendant's story had been systematically dismantled. Carlisle's strategy focused on attacking the reliability of the evidence and suggesting that Henrik had been the victim of an elaborate frame-up orchestrated by people who envied his success. My client is guilty of nothing more than surviving a terrible tragedy, Carlisle argued. He has been made a scapegoat by those who cannot accept that sometimes, despite our best efforts, good people die, and there is nothing heroic about survival, only guilt and the burden of continuing to live. Carlisle suggested that Ezra Kowalski had planted evidence to frame Henrik, possibly in collaboration with other trappers who resented the Norwegian immigrant success. He argued that the journal entries could have been forged, and that the stolen property could have been planted in Henrik's root cellar by anyone with access to his homestead. The defense's most effective moment came when Henrik himself took the stand. Speaking in a voice barely above a whisper, he recounted the horror of watching families die around him, of hearing children cry for help he couldn't provide, and of making the terrible decision to save what money and valuables he could rather than let them disappear with the bodies. I failed them, Henrik testified, tears streaming down his face. I was supposed to be their guide, their protector, and I failed them, but I am not a murderer. I am a broken man who has to live every day with the knowledge that 23 good people trusted me with their lives, and I wasn't strong enough or skilled enough to save them. Henrik's testimony was compelling, and for a moment it seemed possible that he might be able to create enough doubt to avoid conviction. But Prosecutor Mitchell's cross-examination systematically destroyed Henrik's credibility by forcing him to explain the increasingly obvious contradictions in his story. Mr. Olson, Mitchell asked, if you were truly trapped with the families for 4 days, how do you explain Mrs. Kowalski's testimony that she saw you alone at the hidden camp calmly loading supplies on the very day you claim to have been fighting wolves? Henrik's answer that Mrs. Kowalski was mistaken about the date or had seen someone else was unconvincing. When Mitchell pressed him about the detailed preparations at the hidden camp, Henrik's explanations became increasingly desperate and contradictory. The moment that sealed Henrik's fate came when Mitchell produced the final piece of evidence, a letter found hidden in Henrik's cabin, written but never sent to a contact in Minneapolis. The letter dated March 1st, 1008. 189 discussed Henrik's plans to expand his business operations to include routes through Montana Territory, where opportunities for profit are even greater than in Dakota. The letter made it clear that Henrik viewed the February tragedy not as a devastating failure, but as a successful test of methods he planned to use again. He was already identifying potential victims and scouting new locations for future crimes. I have perfected techniques for managing large groups in isolated areas. The letter read, the key is maintaining their trust while systematically eliminating any possibility of escape or rescue. The February operation yielded substantial profits with minimal risk exposure. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts. 23 charges of premeditated murder. Judge Hartfield, in passing sentence, described Henrik Olsen's crimes as an affront to every principle upon which civilized society depends. You betrayed the trust of families who saw in you their hope for a better life. Judge Hartfield stated, you planned their deaths with the cold calculation of a businessman planning a transaction. You watched children die while you remained comfortable and well-fed, counting their parents' money. For these crimes, there can be only one sentence. Henrik Olsen was hanged at the territorial prison in Bismarck on September 12, 1889. According to witnesses, he maintained his innocence until the end, insisting that he had been the victim of a conspiracy by jealous competitors and vengeful immigrants who could not accept that a Norwegian had succeeded where they had failed. The case established legal precedents for prosecuting complex murder cases in territorial courts, and highlighted the vulnerability of frontier families to predators who exploited their trust and desperation. More importantly, it revealed the need for better oversight of the guide services that families depended upon for survival during westward migration. The homesteads that the 6 families had planned to establish were eventually claimed by other settlers, but none thrived. The locals said the land was cursed, though more practical observers noted that the remote locations Henrik had chosen for his victims were poorly suited for farming and dangerously isolated from supply routes and medical assistance. The territorial government implemented new regulations requiring guides to register with local authorities and provide references from previous clients. A reward system was established for reporting suspicious behavior among frontier service providers, and territorial marshals began conducting periodic inspections of guide operations. But the most lasting impact of the Henrik Olsen case was the change it brought to how frontier families approached the decision to trust strangers with their lives. The tragedy shattered the assumption that survival skills and professional reputation were sufficient guarantees of a guide's character. Families began traveling in larger groups, hiring multiple guides to check each other's decisions, and establishing communication schedules with authorities that would trigger searches if contact was lost. The personal effects recovered from Henrik's cash were eventually returned to surviving relatives back east. Thomas Bergstrom's brother in Milwaukee used the family's savings to establish a scholarship fund for children orphaned by frontier tragedies. Dr. Hartwell's medical equipment was donated to the territorial hospital where it served frontier communities for over a decade. Michael Brennan, whose war-damaged nerves had made him sensitive to Henrik's deceptions, struggled with survivors' guilt for years after the trial. He eventually became a territorial marshal himself, specializing in investigating suspicious disappearances and missing person cases. His detailed reports from the Henrik Olsen investigation became required reading for law enforcement officers throughout the Dakota Territory. Ezra Kowalski, the trapper whose discovery had exposed Henrik's crimes, refused all rewards offered by the territorial government. He continued working his trap lines along the Little Missouri River, but neighbors reported that he was never quite the same after finding those children's remains. Sarah Kowalski later said her husband would sometimes wake in the middle of the night, convinced he could hear children crying in the wind. The site of Henrik's hidden camp became a landmark of sorts among trappers and hunters who worked the Badlands. Local legend held that anyone who camped there would hear sounds of children playing in the distance, but investigators who examined these reports found they could be explained by wind patterns and the acoustic properties of the canyon system. More troubling were the persistent reports of other caches of supplies found in remote locations throughout the territory. Over the following decade, territorial authorities discovered at least 6 other sites that appeared to have been prepared for extended stays in isolated areas. None contained evidence of crimes, but their existence suggested that Henrik Olsen might not have been unique among frontier guides who saw opportunity in their client's vulnerability. The case files remained sealed until 1923, when historian Dr. Margaret Lindholm was granted access while researching frontier crime for her doctoral dissertation. Dr. Lindholm's analysis revealed that Henrik's methods had been far more sophisticated than even the prosecution had realized. He had been operating his deadly scheme for at least 3 years before the February 1889 tragedy, and had likely been responsible for the disappearances of several smaller parties whose fates were never solved. Henrik Olsen represented a type of frontier predator that we are only beginning to understand. Dr. Lindholm wrote in her 1925 book, Wolves Among Sheep, Crime and Justice in Territorial America. He exploited the very qualities that made frontier settlement possible: trust, cooperation, and the willingness to depend on strangers for survival, to commit crimes that would have been impossible in more settled communities. The financial records seized from Henrik's property revealed the full scope of his criminal enterprise. Over 3 years, he had accumulated wealth equivalent to what a successful businessman might earn in a decade. He had used this money to purchase multiple properties under different names, suggesting he had been planning to expand his operations throughout the Western Territories. Most chilling of all was the discovery of a detailed map found hidden in Henrik's cabin wall during renovations in 1902. The map marked not just the locations of his supply caches, but also the routes used by immigrant families traveling to homestead sites throughout Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado. Each route was annotated with notes about typical travel times, seasonal weather patterns, and the locations of natural shelters that could serve as killing grounds. The map suggested that Henrik had been planning a campaign of systematic murder that would have dwarfed the February 1889 tragedy, if not for Ezra Kowalski's discovery and the subsequent investigation. Henrik might have continued operating for years, leaving a trail of missing families across the western frontier. The Henrik Olsen case became required study material at the newly established Territorial Law Enforcement Academy, and elements of the investigation were incorporated into federal guidelines for prosecuting complex murder cases in frontier jurisdictions. The legal precedents established during the trial influenced territorial law for decades, particularly regarding the use of circumstantial evidence and the prosecution of crimes where bodies could not be recovered. But perhaps the most important legacy of the case was the awareness it created among frontier families about the dangers of blind trust. The tragedy served as a reminder that the qualities that enabled survival on the frontier, self-reliance, resourcefulness, and the ability to exploit others' vulnerabilities, could just as easily be turned to criminal purposes by those who lacked moral constraints. In the end, Henrik Olsen's story stands as a dark counterpoint to the mythology of frontier heroism. While history celebrates the guides, scouts, and pioneers who helped families build new lives in dangerous territory, the case reminds us that among those who possessed the skills to survive in the wilderness were some who used those same skills to prey upon the innocent. The 23 victims of Henrik's calculated cruelty, Thomas and Elena Bergstrom and their daughters, Dr. Samuel and Rebecca Hartwell and their children, the Kowalski brothers with their dreams of prosperity, Patrick and Catherine Brennan, seeking healing for their war-damaged son, and elderly Martha Linkfist, who simply wanted to die as a free woman on her own land, represented the hopes and dreams that drove westward expansion. Their death served as a brutal reminder that the frontier's promise of freedom and opportunity came with dangers that no amount of preparation could entirely eliminate. This mystery shows us that the real horror of the American frontier wasn't always found in natural disasters, Indian attacks, or wild animals. Sometimes it came in the form of a trusted guide with pale blue eyes and a reassuring smile who saw other people's dreams as opportunities for profit and their trust as a weakness to be exploited. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or might there be more victims of Henrik Olsen's crime still waiting to be discovered in the vast Dakota Badlands? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.